Hi, so the next story we're going to read is one called The Most Dangerous Game, and it's one of my very favorite stories. It doesn't look so short when you see it in the textbook, but trust me, it is a short story. It's a great place to talk about characterization, and there are many different ways that authors can choose to characterize the characters in a book. One way is round versus flat characters. So, round character is definitely not a character that has been eating too much. Rather, it's a character with many definable traits. Kind of like Han Solo, if you've ever seen the Star Wars movies. He's pretty complicated. Like, he seems kind of rough and gruff on the outside, but underneath he's kind of a sensitive guy. A flat character is not a character that's been run over by a truck. Rather, it's a character that lacks depth. Like this guy right here. I think his name is Boba Fett. He doesn't say anything. There's nothing else we get about him except for silent and evil. We can also talk about static versus dynamic characters. And static characters do not change. This is how I remember it. A static character stays the same. Sort of like Thomas. He's always stuck on that track. He doesn't change. He's always got a smile on his face. Rather, a dynamic character goes through dramatic changes throughout the story. The way I remember this is if you took dynamite and put it in your bedroom, it would probably look dramatically different when you're finished. I wouldn't recommend this. But think about Transformers. They're more than meets the eye. Sometimes they look like a vehicle. Sometimes they look like a space alien robot. So they go through major changes. We can also talk about direct characterization versus indirect characterization. So, for example, when Jake entered the room, everyone smiled in anticipation of laughing till they cried. When Jake did his Larry the Cable Guy impersonation the last time, Cindy actually wet her pants because she laughed so hard. Now, we can infer from this that Jake is probably pretty funny without the author directly telling us that he's funny. That's indirect characterization, okay? However, with this example, it says Jake was a funny guy with a great sense of humor. So we are getting a direct reference for what type of character Jake is. So an indirect character is when you have to infer what the character is like through dialogue or through other context in the story. Direct characterization is when the author directly tells us specifically what a character is like. Let's talk about exposition. That's background information that the reader needs to know in order to understand the present story. For example, we're going to read a novel down the road called To Kill a Mockingbird, and it's important to know that 5 years before the story takes place, Scout's mother passed away. So we would need to know that in order to understand some of the current events. So let's talk a little bit more about plot structure in a story, and I'm sure you've heard all of this before. So complication and rising action, these are the moments when conflicts drive that plot forward. So it causes our main character to take some sort of action, and that causes further problems. It drives that plot forward towards the climax. So when you look at this plot curve, the rising action occurs right here, driving that plot word forward. Next, we're going to talk about climax. And it's the moment of great emotional intensity or suspense in the plot. It's often the most exciting, most intense part of the story. But I always ask myself, because this can be kind of subjective, who is my main character? What's my main character's goal? And what's the point in the story where we as readers realize whether or not that main character is actually going to reach his or her goal? And that's where the climax is. It's right here at the top of the plot curve. Also, if your story ends at the climax, you have something called a cliffhanger. Following action are the moments after the climax where that conflict begins to be resolved and things kind of get wrapped up in a nice little neat package. And lastly, you've got the conclusion or the resolution. And that's when all the struggles are over for the main character. Most of us like happy endings. We like things to end nice and neat. If the struggles are over for the main character, but things did not end up well, our main character is probably not with us anymore. Next, let's talk about conflict. So internal versus external conflict. So an internal struggle is when there's two opposing needs or desires or decisions that the main character has to make. So for example, do you order pizza or do you get tacos? Do you like Ohio State or do you like Michigan? Do you like baseball? Do you like football? These are big decisions, people, and they can often lead us looking like this. An external conflict is when the struggle is outside the main character. So, if some other person is making you look like this, you are having an external conflict. And there are 4 types: man versus man versus nature, man versus society, and man versus self. I know you've probably learned a few other ones, but these are kind of the main 4 types that you're going to be talking about until college. So man versus man is when a main character is put against another character, like Batman and the Joker. Man versus nature is when a natural phenomenon is causing a problem for the main character. So, for example, if you were running from this, you are having a conflict with nature. Man versus society is when the character is put against the systems or beliefs of a group. Take the civil rights movement, for example. At the time, Dr. King's beliefs were not very popular, so he was having a struggle with society to try and change their views. And then lastly is man versus self. And that's when the main character has to overcome setbacks or shortcomings, make personal decisions, overcome fears, kind of epitomized in this picture right here. And lastly, we're going to talk about foreshadowing. And that's the use of hints or clues in a story to suggest what action is to come. So it says, take the secret plans, but make sure they don't get in the hands of the evil Dr. Zoid. If he were to get them, he could take over the world. So if we heard this, we would probably know that he's going to get the plans and try to take over the world. So these are the terms we'll be specifically applying to the Most Dangerous Game. It's also fair game to have some of the other terms that we talked about in previous stories. If you have any questions, come in. You can jot down some notes. Again, probably expect a little quiz just to see how much you understand. Thanks so much. Have a great evening.